Brief history of slavery in the United States. The United States slave past is one of the most tragic and dark chapters in that nation's history. The country was founded by British settlers who arrived in the east of the country in the 17th century before an intense revolution between the years between 1775 and 1783. Make no mistake, slavery was then allowed in the 13 British colonies. Something that you should know: slavery was part of the history of England long before reaching the western lands of the New World, when they enslaved their own people. And let's not talk about the slavery of the Irish. Something that you should understand: the British colonizers were not the first to traffic African slaves on the American continent. Empires such as the Spanish, French and Portuguese had already done it previously in the colonies of Latin America and the Caribbean, mostly in Brazil. Slaves who arrived in the country from Africa were violently captured and transported to the American continent on slave ships. Many lost their lives along the way due to hunger and disease that spread on the ships. The Africans traveled in piles, as if they were merchandise. African slaves were chained and crammed into a space so small that they could not move. The slaves were chained in the warehouses, and the conditions of sanitation were painful, since they had no place to expel their excrement other than the ground itself. Suicides were common and deaths were numerous, since the wineries they used to flood and drown the tied slaves. Like many, a third of this group died on each voyage that lasted 8 weeks. Those who survived were often separated from their families and sold to different slave owners in the slave market between the different colonies. Slavers carried out the so-called triangular trade. They loaded rum, tobacco and weapons in Europe, exchanged it for slaves and ivory in Africa, and sold the slaves for profit in America to various colonies, from where they returned with raw materials and minerals to Europe. During transit, approximately 50% of the slaves died. Something you should understand: slave ships were designed to transport more than 500 people, as close together as possible, on a 2-day trip months from West Africa to America. The hardships and suffering suffered on those long voyages across the Atlantic produced such terror among the poor African slaves who came to wish they were dead rather than continue living in those conditions. More than 12 million African blacks were sent to America between the 16th and 19th centuries. Of these, an estimated 645,000 were sent to what is now known as the United States. The largest number was transported to the Caribbean and Brazil, where life expectancy was short and slaves had to be constantly replaced. Life expectancy was much higher in the United States, generally because of better food, less illness, less work, and better health care, so the numbers grew rapidly, with births of new slaves exceeding deaths. When did slavery begin in the United States? The first 20 blacks arrived near Jamestown, Virginia, in 1619, brought by Dutch traders who had commandeered a Spanish slave ship. The Spanish normally baptized slaves in Africa before shipping them, and English law considered them baptized Christians exempt from slavery, so these blacks joined some 1,000 indentured officials already situated in the colony. The slave population in the United States had grown to 4 million according to the 1860 census. It must be taken into account that within the aberrations produced by the slave owners there was also the obligation of procreation among slaves by their owners. This arose from the idea that a strong woman with a strong man gave birth to a strong black child, a new slave. Most of the slaves were owned by plantation owners, who are defined by historians as having 20 or more slaves. 95% of black people lived in the South, representing a third of the population of that region. By comparison, in the North, black people only represented 2% of its population. Slave labor was a major factor in the accumulation of wealth in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. The punishment of black slaves by slave owners. The slaveholders no doubt used their positions of power to maintain tight control over the Southern population, surveilling and imprisoning poor whites who might cause trouble or disrupt the slave system. Although they were more likely to be flogged and beaten by individuals, slaves and free blacks were also victims of the brutality of the carceral state. Most slave owners preferred to punish the enslaved in private, as a whipping still allowed workers to immediately return to work, while imprisonment interrupted their work schedule. Thus, the vast majority of slaves incarcerated in local jails were runaways who were held until their masters could retrieve them. Louisiana was the only Deep South state to regularly place slaves in the penitentiary, as an alternative to hanging. The other states simply brutalized enslaved African Americans in private and put them back to work as soon as possible. Free blacks, however, were frequently jailed for the same reasons as poor whites. Most prisoners before the war were not incarcerated for murder, rape, or even assault. Instead, about half of them spent years behind bars or at hard labor for petty property crimes like petty theft and robbery. Many others were there for non-violent behavioral crimes such as vagrancy, drunkenness, and gambling. The point of most of these arrests was neither to punish nor to reform. Instead, slave owners used these laws to dominate and scare poor whites and free blacks into compliance, imprisoning them for months or years at a time, often without a chance to stand trial. In other words, slaves were denied the ability to make basic life decisions, such as who their partner would be, how they would spend their free time, or how much time they wanted to spend in relationships with their children, rights that the white masters took for granted. Culture on white plantations dictated the behavior of plantation owners' wives. Social norms stipulated that women had to be docile, soft, and should turn a blind eye to the infidelities of their husbands, whose existence they were well known. While white women were thought to be physically inferior to men, they were believed to be morally superior creatures, hence the reason why white women of the South should be praised for their sexual purity and virtue. Although men frequently had sexual relations, either with slaves or with other white mistresses, it was not socially acceptable for white women to do the same. Black women were both fetishistic and considered impure, when viewed in contrast to the modesty of white women. Thus, at the height of slavery, relationships with female slaves were decidedly culturally unacceptable. However, just because these relationships were frowned upon did not mean that white men resisted crossing the line of this social taboo. They didn't. On January 13, 1777, Prince Hall and 7 other black men petitioned the General Court of Massachusetts, on behalf of a large number of Negroes, insisting that they had a natural and inalienable right to liberty. The petitions demonstrate that black people in different parts of New England asserted an African identity during the American Revolution. Historians generally note this trend with African churches and societies at the turn of the century, creating an African American identity and a new nation. In the mid-1780s, a complex mix of addressing blacks in the colony and then state authorities, bringing slaves lawsuits against the entire institution of slavery, and an increase in private manumissions derailed with the future of slavery in Massachusetts. Britain's colonial breakup did not end slavery in the southern states. Emancipation occurred in the northern states little by little and with great hesitation, even fear. Furthermore, abolition compensated northern slave owners, who did not guarantee citizenship to free blacks, and at least partially, which gave rise to a movement to send free blacks to Africa. The division between slaveholders and abolitionists became more intense in 1860. Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party won the election. Republicans supported the prohibition of slavery in all territories of the United States. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out. The United States was divided into different regions, and the southern states, which were in favor of slavery, united to form the Confederate States. They wanted to become independent from the rest, who were increasingly opposed to slavery, and form their own country. The northern states joined together to form the Union, which was the result of the Civil War in which they were defeated in 1865. In 1787, when nearly 300,000 people of African descent populated every state of the new nation, many leaders hoped that slavery would decline, as George Washington put it, little by little, slowly, surely, and imperceptibly. The hope was vain. Eventually, of course, slavery ended. But the cost of the delay was horrible. The document of the Founding Fathers consigned millions of human beings to chattel servitude. In the 78 years between the writing of the Constitution and the end of the Civil War, the United States became the preeminent slaveholding nation in the world, with a population at the time of emancipation minus 3.9 million than any other in history. In 1793, Congress passed a law to enforce the fugitive slave provision of the Constitution, which guaranteed slave owners the right to claim their human property on the soil of free states. When Northern consciences resisted the measure in subsequent decades, Congress passed the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which historian Eric Foner has labeled the most powerful exercise of federal authority in the United States in the entire era before of the Civil War. On January 1, 1808, at St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, the Reverend Absalom Jones gave his Thanksgiving sermon for the abolition of the African slave trade. Scholars have explained how Lincoln could emancipate the slaves less for his own sake than for the nation's sake. Yet, paradoxically, Lincoln's nation was also a slave nation. People probably know the significance of January 1, 1863 as they do the significance of January 1, 1808. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the North winning the Civil War 2 years later have left 1863 as the marker for the end of all slavery in the United States. On March 2, 1807, Congress voted that the slave trade to the United States would become illegal on the first day of the following year. After the Revolution, this interweaving of African and American identities with threads of revolutionary ideals was fragile and sometimes controversial. During the early Republic, blacks organized African self-help societies and churches, and in the face of intensifying hostility to some efforts to leave Africa, but they also embraced the emerging American values of education and enterprise, and joined a broader public sphere despite increasingly violent racism. Black lynching came to an end in the West, a new mob movement began in the South. This was entirely political, its purpose being to suppress the colored vote by intimidation and murder. Thousands of killers banded together under the name of the Ku Klux Klan, Midnight Raiders, Knights of the Golden Circle, etc., etc. A reign of terror spread, overcoming, shooting, and killing colored people by the thousands. In a few years, the objective was achieved, and the black vote was suppressed. But the mob murder continued. Maggie Stenhouse, who was born a slave in South Carolina, had more personal run-ins with the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. She took off her robe and the door from her face, hung it on a nail in the room, and said, "Where's that Jim Jesus?" He took him out of the room. The crowd slips away. Mom took the 3 small children, but she forgot about me and ran away too. They beat Dad until they thought he was dead and threw him in a nearby corner. He was beaten almost to death, just hacked to pieces. He crawled into bed and woke me up and back to the footsteps. I thought he was bled to death on the steps. Mama came back out and found that he was alive. She manipulated it and lived 30 years after that. We left in the morning. From 1882, the year 52 were lynched, to the present, it has been lynching along the color line. Mob murder increased annually until in 1892 more than 200 victims were lynched, and statistics show that 3,284 men, women and children have been executed in this quarter century. During the last 10 years from 1899 to 1908 inclusive, the number 959 were lynched. Of this number 102 were white, while the colored victims numbered 857. No other nation, civilized or savage, burns its criminals. Only under bars and stars is the possible human holocaust. 28 human beings burned at the stake, one of them a woman and 2 of them children, is the appalling indictment against American civilization, the appalling tribute the nation pays to the color line. After the abolition of slavery, in some states and cities, especially in the South, Jim Crow laws were implemented to maintain segregation between whites and blacks. Their motto was separate but equal, but in practice it was a way of discriminating against the black population. Government positions and important jobs were reserved for whites. In addition, blacks had problems voting and could not mix with whites. Thank you very much for your visit.